Welcome again, everybody. My name is Dawn Salerno. I'm the Executive Director here at the Roach Jones Duff House and Garden Museum. And I like to mention that because we're all in cyberspace a lot these days. So to kind of ground us in an actual place, here I am at the Roach Jones Duff House and Garden Museum, a property dating back to 1834. And we are very soon going to be having some programs in person, and I hope to see you at some of those. I do want to mention a couple of upcoming virtual programs that we have. The last couple of the season, until we can actually get outside and hold some safe outdoor programming. In April, we have Growing Roses Organically. That's a talk by Dr. Paul Raymond, and that's going to be on Thursday, April 8th, 5:30. And then the next week, and this is all kind of in line with Earth Day and thinking about our stewardship of nature, we have the physical science of climate change, and that's going to be a lecture by, it just so happens, another Dr. Raymond. Yes, it's the son to the first Dr. Raymond, and his talk is on April 14th, 5:30. So that programming is on our website. I'm going to put a little link to our website in the chat in a moment. I welcome you to check out all of our programs, which, as I said, will be going kind of moving outside come May, June, July, August. We have a lovely garden and tented patio where we hold our programming. The other thing I want to mention is that we have had, since the start of the pandemic and all this virtual programming we're doing, 95% of our programming has been suggested donation only or free. So if you're willing to make a donation towards our programs like this, and like those two that I just mentioned next month, I'll put a link in the chat where you can go right to our PayPal page and make any donation. It's a suggested donation only for tonight's talk. And we always appreciate those donations. So thank you so much. They go right to support more programming like this. With that, I'm going to assume Jonathan was one of the first to arrive. And he's going, there he is. I want to introduce the first part of our History Happy Hour is I'll call it the happy part. And that's our mixologist, where I'm so lucky to have him here. We had him at the last History Happy Hour. He's here for the next one as well. And that is Jonathan Pogash, the cocktail guru, which is just like the best name ever. He is one of the most premier cocktail consultants and bartenders for restaurants and spirit companies. His signature cocktails can be seen and enjoyed in many of North America's most upscale cocktail lounges and restaurants. With nearly 20 years experience in the hospitality industry, Jonathan shares his insights with the most influential publications from around the world, and he contributes his unique talents to morning television shows and national radio. He has appeared on such programs as NBC's Weekend Today in New York and Fox and Friends. Just as executive chefs may work their way up through the ranks behind the line, Jonathan has worked his way up from being a bar back at the Russian Tea Room in New York City to owner and president of the Cocktail Guru. I would like to let him take it from here. Get your shakers and ice ready. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dawn. It is a pleasure, as always, to be here and able to make cocktails for you virtually, which is all I've been doing since last March, actually exactly a year. And as Dawn mentioned, I'm the founder, president, owner, CEO, whatever you want to call it, of the Cocktail Guru. You may have seen me locally. I do local TV on the Road Show on WPRI in Providence. I do cocktails. And then I've also designed the beverage programs for several local places in New Bedford. Cultivator Shoals when they first opened, DNB Burger when they added a liquor license, before they changed to DNB Kitchen and Bar. I think that's what it is now. And then I helped revamp the cocktail program at the Black Whale and also at Not Your Average Joe's. Little Moss, I helped open that spot up as well. So I've been all over the place, but I'm here today to make you a special historical cocktail. And I'm kind of a geek about cocktails and history and trying to figure out, well, other people have done the legwork for me. They figured out when, cocktail recipes have been printed down and mentioned and who created them and all of that stuff. And this cocktail in particular, I was sort of inspired by today's piece of art that we'll be talking about later. And I decided to present to you a classic whiskey sour with a little bit of a twist. So the ingredients that we will need for this classic whiskey sour are, first of all, your bar tools. So I actually have what's called a Boston shaker. It's a mixing glass and a mixing tin. And usually it will come with a strainer called a Hawthorne strainer. And what I love about these cocktails, really the meat of the history of cocktails in America really are from about 1800 to 1920. And so Roach Jones being an establishment that was built in 1830, I think that all of that cocktails in general just really fit very well into the history of Roach Jones Duff. If you don't have a Boston shaker, maybe you have a cobbler shaker, which is what this is called. It's 3 pieces. And if you don't have that, then you can use a mason jar. I've used that before to shake cocktails. You can also use a water bottle or like a protein shaker to shake cocktails. This will be a shaken cocktail. Ingredients-wise, what we need are, well, whiskey. So I've got my bourbon right over here. You can use any type of whiskey. So as we probably know, all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. There are several different types of whiskeys: bourbon whiskey, rye whiskey, sour mash, Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey. Any whiskey will do for this cocktail, actually. I'm using a bourbon. And we need our citrus element. So I have some lemon juice here, actually. These are, this is actually a company called Cheeky, and we use them in our cocktail box kits that we put together now for all of our virtual events, which we do for big corporations, just FYI, at thecocktailguru.com. You can see more info about that. So I've got my lemon juice, and then we need a sweet element to balance out the citrus, right? Because this cocktail is called a whiskey sour, which is in the family, overarching family of sours in the cocktail world. And simple syrup would be the way to go if you have that. It's equal parts sugar and water, very easy. I'm actually going to do a little bit of a twist that I decided to do last minute and use maple syrup. So if you've got maple syrup at home, great, you can use that. If you've got simple syrup, great. If you have honey, you can also use that. I like doing honey syrup, which is like equal parts honey and warm water. So I like to play around with different types of sweeteners. What I'm going to do is walk you through making this drink. Oh, and finally, of course, we got an egg. Okay, so there are some recipes for whiskey sours that contain egg and some that don't. Classically, there is a recipe from 1862 that contained egg white in it from sort of the forefather of mixology. His name was Jerry Thomas, and he wrote a book called The Bartender's Guide, or How to Mix Drinks. And it's kind of our Bible, one of our Bibles, and he included an egg white. A lot of classic drinks with citrus from the 1800s included egg white to kind of cut the citrus a little bit. Which is interesting, and it creates a really nice texture, a nice mouthfeel. And other ingredients, oh, and I'm doing a garnish of a slice of orange and a nice real maraschino cherry, not the fake bright red kinds. If you have those, sorry, I do not approve. It must be a real maraschino marasca cherry, not the fake ones. Okay, so let's go ahead and start making this cocktail. Oh, I also have a jigger, which is a measuring tool. The big side is 1 ounce. The big side is 2 ounce. Small side is 1 ounce. If you don't have a jigger, that's okay. You can use a tablespoon. A tablespoon equals ½ of an ounce. Now I'm going to angle this down. Also, as you'll notice, I wore my, I broke out my lemon shirt, which has not been broken out in many, many months because this drink does have lemon in it. All right, so first we're going to start off with our egg, and it's just going to be the egg white, as I mentioned before. And I'm just going to crack it on the tin part and then separate it. And, well, we do the egg first, and that's because just in case we get a little bit of that yolk in there, we can discard it. All right, here we go. I have my little plate to discard my yolk. Now, if you're a little weirded out by using eggs in cocktails, please don't be. It is safe. I've heard some bar professionals say that you have a better chance of choking on a bar peanut than you do of getting salmonella from an egg in a cocktail. And I always say you have a better chance of getting salmonella from a raw oyster than you do from a raw egg. Okay, so we've got that in there now. And I'm going to add my whiskey. I know, hilarious. I'm doing 2 ounces of my whiskey, okay? And that is a nice, healthy pour. And I'm measuring out my ingredients. And you may have gone to some spots that I've done, and you see that they are measuring out their ingredients. That's for consistency, making sure all drinks are made the same exact way every single time by each and every bartender on each and every day. That's the point. Okay, so now I've got my lemon juice, and I'm going to do 3/4 of an ounce of my freshly squeezed lemon juice. And if you've got your simple syrup now, go ahead and add 3/4 of an ounce of simple syrup. As I'm using maple syrup, that is a little bit more concentrated than simple syrup. So I'm just doing 1/2 ounce of maple syrup in my cocktail right there. This is a really nice drink to kind of, with the maple syrup, to bridge the gap between winter and spring, which is essentially where we are now. So now here's a little bit of a technique. I'm just going to raise this because we're doing a little bit of a different technique. We're not just going to add ice and shake. We're going to dry shake, which means shake first without ice. And that is to emulsify all of the ingredients and get that egg to mix and to fluff up a little bit, okay? So we're going to dry shake. If you're dry shaking at home, just so you know, your cocktail shaker may start to leak a little bit, and that means it's working. So you may get a little dirty. We're just going to give it a little bit of a shake, a gentle shake, not as hard of a shake as we would if we had ice in it. Okay, so I'm using my entire arm. This is a little bit of a workout for me. This is how I've been getting my pandemic workouts, is making cocktails. Okay, now you'll see that it is starting to fluff up a little bit, which is great. So now we will add ice. Okay, I've got my ice. I'm going to fill up my glass with ice. And another bit of history. Do you know who popularized ice? Actually, a Massachusetts native named Frederick Tudor in the early 1800s created the frozen water trade by chopping off blocks of ice from frozen lakes in the Berkshires and carting them by horse to the big cities. And he made millions of dollars, became a multimillionaire, went international with his frozen water trade. We were drinking room temperature or warm drinks before then. So thank you, Frederick Tudor. So now we will shake it awake, don't rock it to sleep. And we shake for 8 Mississippis, very, very hard. Look at my shaker face. Let me know how I'm shaking. You can tell a lot from a person by their shaker face. All right, you ready? Let's go. 8 Mississippis. Count with me. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, 6 Mississippi, 7 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi. Hey, thank you. Okay, so now actually we've got a really nice, you see that fluff action right there? Yes, a little bit. And I will take my Hawthorne strainer, place it on top, and just strain my drink. There should be some really nice foam action happening. Okay, and that egg white creates a really nice texture for the drink. And what I'm going to do actually is add an extra little top off flare garnish here. And I'm just going to move this over here so you can see. That painting that you're going to see in just a moment, this little design kind of reminds me of it, the sort of little frills. Okay, these are some lavender bitters. So I'm just going to actually put a few lavender bitters, little drops around, make a little design, and some cherry cask bitters. I know, you may not have these at home, but that's okay. There we go. And you may, yes, you can see it. Totally. Now I'm going to take my cocktail pick and just run it through. Make little design. I feel like Bob Ross. And then our real garnish will be a slice of orange. I believe this is a blood orange, actually. And my real maraschino cherry. And I love this game. This is like bobbing for apples, but with cocktail ingredients. Kind of putting the pick down in there. And, oh, there we go. I'm just going to lay that garnish right on top, just like that. And that, my friends, is a classic whiskey sour, but it's really a twist on a classic whiskey sour, a maple whiskey sour or whiskey maple sour. In any case, I'm going to give it a sip and then give you a quick little tidbit on the history of the whiskey sour. Oh yeah, that's good. That's very good. Now, the oldest historical mention of the whiskey sour, like I said, we're geeks about this, was actually in a Wisconsin newspaper, the Waukesha Plain Dealer in 1870. And for those of you who've been to Wisconsin, you know that they're really into their whiskey and brandy cocktails. And if you go and you get an old fashioned in Wisconsin, it's pretty much going to be a whiskey sour because they add citrus and they add simple syrup and sometimes soda water to their whiskey sours. And it's essentially a whiskey sour. But like I said, Jerry Thomas in 1862 printed it down in his he did print one in his recipe book. So in 1870, that's about 8 years later, was in a newspaper. So a little bit different between the book and the newspaper. But we know that the drink itself predates that. Probably a very, very popular cocktail in the early 1800s, especially when ice was first introduced into mixed drinks. They would have gin sours, brandy sours, whiskey sours, sours all around. Well, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. Cheers. Hope to see you all very soon, possibly in person sometime in the near future. But in the meantime, it's virtual all the way. And I love it. Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers, Jonathan. Thank you so much. So why don't we, I'd love to, if anyone has a question for Jonathan before we totally switch gears and talk about painting, oil paintings from 1830, you may ask now. He is a wealth of information, as you can tell. Are there any questions on the whiskey sour?
Ask now or forever hold your peace.
That's right. Or your cocktail. Forever hold your cocktail.
Does the cocktail guru come to and do private parties?
Yes, 100%. Reach out to me on my website, thecocktailguru.com.
Yep.
And I am happy to get you information on our private events.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Great. We have somebody joining us, so let me just let them in. And so great. And thank you to Jonathan. He's been really wonderful. He's been really wonderful to be part of this program. And I was thinking the same thing, Sam, is like, wouldn't he be great at a party or another RJD, you know, when we're all meeting again in person? I think he'd be
maybe some event.
Exactly.
Small
this
event.
Will not be the last time you see Jonathan. So with that, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I want to first introduce our next presenter, because the idea of this talk is that I have a conversation with somebody, a member of the community, and I got to pick these members of the community. We had the curator of the art museum the last time in January, and this time we have somebody I met as a colleague initially. So I want to introduce you to her, and then we're going to talk about this painting in the RJD's collection. So Jordan, and if I were to pronounce it with a French accent, it would be Pouliot Latham. Jordan is the Director of Advocacy and Resource Development at the YWCA Southeastern Mass, located right here, literally down the street from the Roach Jones stuff in New Bedford. Jordan grew up in Manchester, New Hampshire, but moved to the New Bedford area with her husband in 2013. She now lives in Rochester in a historic farmhouse, which sounds lovely, by the way, with her children, Archer and Andy, their dog Butters, and kitten Lulu. That also sounds lovely. Jordan loves the work she's been able to do every day at the YWCA, but when she's not working, she loves being outside with her family, playing sports like soccer and archery, and eating delicious meals thanks to her chef husband. Jordan majored in history, so she's actually a ringer. I did not know this when I asked her to be here. She majored in history in undergraduate studies and then studied American studies in graduate school. So what a ringer I chose to be here tonight. She's excited to be here tonight and to learn more about and explore the material culture of the Roach Jones Duff House. So, so thank you, Jordan, for being here. I'm going to set us up a little bit and then turn it over to Jordan. So I'm just allow me to share screen here. And you'll see what painting we're talking about tonight. So I'm hoping you're seeing, everyone's seeing a portrait of Joanna Roach. So if not, unmute and tell me that you're not seeing it, okay? Because I assume you can see that. So as it says, this is the portrait of Joanna Roach that we'll be talking about tonight. It is currently hanging in the, what we call the children's room here at the RJD. Joanna's life dates are right there on the screen, 1826 to 1911. The painting is an approximation of 1830. It's not an exact date, but that's an approximate, which would make her, you know, you could say, is she 4 or 5 in the painting? And this was a gift of Mary Lou Grinnell, who was a board member at one point. There's actually some board members on this in the audience here that probably remember Mary Lou. Mary Lou was very generous. She gave about 16 items to the RJD over several years. And this year, she gave this pretty early on, 1984. We were 3 years old as a museum, and she gave this and 4 other works that year. Since we don't have a sense of size here, I will tell you that this is 42 inches high and 37 inches wide. That's probably a measurement without the frame. It is a gilded gesso frame, which is one of those. Actually, my next slide should show you. If I can advance this. There's the frame. And that's a very appropriate frame for this era portrait. Very kind of lush gesso. And in the file, we keep these, you know, collections files have all this information that I'm conveying to you. Somebody wrote perhaps Chester Harding. Now that's an artist name. His life dates are 1792 to 1866. I don't know who made that judgment. I can't make any better judgment or not, but when I look at some Chester Harding work, he was known for painting very famous people, men and women. And I'm not quite sure, looking at his very like refined, very skilled brush, if this could be a Chester Harding, but I am no expert in that area. So perhaps Chester Harding. So from that, let me see if I have a Chester Harding. There's a Chester Harding. So I don't know. It's, you know, the faces look very similar. It's possible. His life dates are concurrent with that painting. So then I thought I would just tell you a little bit about portraiture of the time. Now, it just so happens I didn't take hours to search for some images of children to show you, but these are slightly more folk style in their rendering. Folk style meaning that the painters were untrained artists. They probably weren't looking at fine examples by English trained painters, you know, in museums. They were self-taught. But what I want you to notice is the general pose, what they're pictured with, how they're dressed, because our painting of Joanna Roach is very similar. You would always be dressed up for a portrait, adult or child. And then what was common was to have some kind of attribute, we would call it, an attribute. In front of you, you have a cat, a book, and then the children to the right, I loved it because they have one of each, right? There's a piece of fruit. I guess that's another piece of fruit, but with the stem. And then there's a book held by the girl on the far right. So the attribute was always meant to tell you something about the sitter. And if you had adults in portraits, they would be most likely be pictured with something that showed their prominence and their importance, because only wealthy people could afford painted portraits in the mid to late 1800s, even into the early 1900s. So, you know, if you were a lawyer, you'd be sat there with a contract. If you were a judge, you'd be sat there with maybe some statute that you were responsible for. These were the attributes that showed you more about the sitter. And otherwise, they're fairly plain. As you can see, plain backgrounds, the curtain in the backdrop of the 3 girls. That's a very common technique to kind of frame the piece. It literally frames the piece with a bright color. And our Joanna has a very plain background herself. So she's just set against a fairly plain background. So then, and I'm almost done. I'm going to let Jordan take over. Joanna Roach. Now, this is her as an adult. This just so happens to be in the New Bedford Whaling Museum collection. So you can go see it. I don't know that it's on show, so it may not be out in the galleries, but it is right here in New Bedford. And so this is a very small rendering of her. It's a miniature. That's a watercolor on porcelain in front of you. And you can see her as an adult. Joanna was actually the granddaughter of our Roach. So we are William Roach Jr. We're his house. He built this house. And Joanna was one of his many, many, many granddaughters. She did live in New Bedford. She overlapped when he lived here in this particular house. Joanna was actually in New Bedford at the time. So it's almost certain she was in this house. She was actually physically here at some points visiting her granddad. And I didn't have a lot of information to share with you, but that's okay, because we want to I do want to let Jordan, kind of give you her take on Joanna. Joanna was one of 5 children. She was the youngest. She actually was named after a Joanna that only lived 2 months. And this was not uncommon at the time that, because of infant mortality rates, people had many children. And 2 of the children of Joseph Roach died. So Joseph Roach was son to William Roach Jr. Joseph Roach had Joanna, and Joanna was the last in the line. But again, she was named after another Joanna Roach who died 2 years earlier. I found it interesting that her own mother died when she was just about 16 years old in 1842. And at that point, she left New Bedford only to go to Milton, Mass, not too far away. And she moved in with her sister. And as far as I could tell, she stayed with her sister for the rest of her life, unmarried, which is has a lot of significance at this time that, I saw it listed in several places, unmarried, because when you look up people of this era, you're always tracing lineages and whose children and husbands and how the families are connected. So Joanna here was listed as unmarried. So I'm going to stop at that point and let Jordan chime in, and we can leave Joanna on the screen, Jordan, if you like, and you can take it from here.
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you everybody for being here this evening, and thank you for the cocktail. I didn't have all the ingredients to do the whiskey sour, but I hope just the whiskey's okay. Yeah, so I had a just absolutely lovely time walking through the museum, and I had sent Dawn a list of items that I could that spoke to me on the trip. But I think particularly being in the children's room, as a parent, I have 2 small children, and just being able to look at all of the material culture there, the dresses and the dollhouse. And I loved the painting of the St. Bernard in the child's room. I feel like that's another thing we could get into maybe on another call, but the portrayal of animals and pets and the emergence of pets as a sign of wealth and culture. But what spoke to me, so I loved picking this photo because of the girlhood associated with it. I looked, I had said to Dawn, I remember learning this in grad school as we were learning about the material culture and portraiture of the new, the colonists and then the new nation and these things I was just recalling being back in grad school 10 years ago. And looking at this portrait that she was portrayed as a child, that she wasn't here dressed to look like an adult. That was a signifier to me, right? That she was dressed as a child, that she was wearing pink. I'm sure too, we could get into the choice of fabric as well, or to even trace that back, where that fabric might have come from or the lace. But, when I look at it, just to see her in pink and even though she's in a gown, she looks like a child to me. And then, which I think is lovely, a celebration of childhood and not just thinking of children as tiny adults, as they were so often portrayed in art and culture, in that, in the time period of the new nation, and really not thinking about it till Gilded Age, turn of the 20th century, where you see more of like a different portrayal of childhood. And I love too, I said to Dawn, so Dawn, I'd love to hear from you more about this too, but then she was holding a book. Like that was also such a conscious choice, that she wasn't holding a doll or a flower, but that they chose in this very expensive project, right? That this would, like, these were all very conscious choices, that she would be holding a book. So I don't know, Dawn, if you had anything more on that. And I know we don't know what the book is, but I don't know if anyone else has that reaction when they look at it, but I see that as such like a celebration of education, and particularly in their daughter and granddaughter, to commission a piece of art like this, and to be promoting education with it. But I don't know if others have that thought, but
I think that's certainly a good point, Jordan. And I mean, it is a choice. You have to remember it's not like a camera where somebody just snaps some candid shot, just at a given moment. This is all constructed. And, a book is a choice over a piece of fruit or a doll. I do know, just reading a little bit about Joanna, she seemed to write letters regularly. Not that others didn't. That was a very common thing to do, is write letters amongst your family members. But I just had to add that, because if she was also just one of those more bookish type children, she was writing her older, I believe it would have been a cousin, but a bit older, there was a lot of correspondence, and this other cousin was obviously a Roach, would say, please extend Joanna my thanks for her letter. I could just read you a bunch of letters from these back and forth with Joanna. And so he was about 16, and I think she was, still about 7 or 8, writing her cousin letters.
Yeah, I love hearing that. I mean, right, we don't want to, it's like, there's no way to really know unless we were to go through her archive, like what was she consuming? What did she grow up doing? But I think it'd be a very cool project to look at her life trajectory, and how she was raised by, in the role of her older siblings, and that she went to live with her sister, that she remained unmarried. I mean, also that's a choice. I think there's a lot here to try to unpack with her that could really date back to her upbringing, that could have been more promoting her being like a woman of letters, and doing her own kind of reading, and maybe writing as well. I mean, we did have women writing novels at this time, and before, right? But like, I like that this, I don't know, it just spoke to me. I don't know if anyone else had thoughts on the choice of the color scheme or the dress. I think the entire children's room in general was really fascinating too, to look at the dolls, and just a celebration of childhood that, again, I know was so rare, particularly when you think of, like you mentioned, on like the high infant mortality, like the high rate, like children did die all the time. So I don't remember studying that as much, I mean, with like the rituals of death and dying, but I do remember reading like childhood was not necessarily something that was celebrated until you kind of have the birth of modern consumerism. So this to me just read as this, like, I don't know, lovely celebration of her girlhood and her childhood.
Well, we can certainly welcome people to chime in if they have impressions. If you want to at this stage, we can do that. People are welcome to unmute, or if you prefer, you can put a question in the chat. I did not say that earlier, but if you'd like, I will read your question to Jordan or share a comment. So some of you have actually been to the museum to see this painting too. So speak up if you have any impressions of this piece or reactions to what Jordan has mentioned. I'm going to go ahead to that adult picture of Joanna if I can. Let's see.
Yes. Oh, I know. That's amazing. You found that in the.
Well, I was so lucky. I thought, and kudos to the Whaling Museum, because it was in a digital collection. I didn't have to physically go to the museum. Not that they're about 4 blocks away, but I found this in their online digital collection, and that's a wonderful thing for them to offer. So here she is, 1845, and what was her life? So she would have been about 20 there? No, wait, somebody do the math. Yeah, she's 19. She's about 19 here. Let's see, let me check the chat, make sure I'm not missing the chat. Any questions from the group, especially if you've been to the RJD to see this in person? You know, I was going to ask you why, you know, of course, my curiosity is always, why did you pick this piece? And I know you had a few, but I think you kind of explained that. How do you think it, you know, when you think of paintings versus now we have photography, and you know, the president still has his portrait painted, but that's, you know, it's obviously not as common as it was if you were of a certain means back then. So I don't know if you want to comment about, you know, the difference between our today capturing images of children the way we do and something like this precious portrait.
I wonder if there's a way that they're really, that they could be very similar. If we think of it, that this would have been hours and hours and hours. Not only was it expensive, but the hours that it would take for her to sit there or stand there to be painted. Like, this was so carefully constructed, as you pointed out. And a lot of people make that claim with social media and presentations today as well, that they're very carefully constructed, they're photoshopped. It leads to a lot of mental health problems for individuals who compare themselves to a version of life that seems unattainable. Like, how is this woman able to keep her children so perfectly constructed? And you want to say, they put in a lot of time and energy to do that. Like, that's not candid. You know, and to think that every part of this was a careful choice that would signal things not in private. This would have been pretty public, right? As you had people in and out of the parlor, or to see these portraits and to think, like, what was the message they were trying to convey to the individuals that entered into their home and to thought of themselves as parents and as a family, and like what values they associated. I think that's something that's really relevant today. It's probably how many of us do interact with others. How are we sharing bits of our character and our values through choices that are publicly, you know, that are like out in the public for them to consume. So I don't know, I've seen that before in certain bumper stickers that people can have, or how they're portraying their children on Instagram. Like, it's all very conscious. So in fact, not much has changed in the almost 200 years, you know, since this was done. But I suppose I like the choices that they made. If they were meant to reflect their values, like, oh, a value of education, a value of, also though, probably, I mean, especially status, like, she's reading, this is leisure. Leisure would be something that not all could even fathom, of having access to leisure and being able to read or participate in childhood because they'd be working. That certainly would have been, you know, the family upbringing I know in Manchester in the mills, you know, and things like that. So there's definitely, you know, this mix of gender and class. But I don't know. I love seeing, oh yeah, I love hearing from like the real art historians, because that is not my background at all. So Dawn, there's a question in the chat from Mel.
I see that. So let's see. So let me, and I do think that this is interesting, that somebody in the audience has actually had their portrait painted as a child, and how wonderful Ruth has had that done. She says her mother read to me, I assume while she had to sit there for hours and hours and hours, you know, and her mother kept her entertained. And that is true that it was mostly the itinerant painters that were traveling around and maybe didn't, you know, they stopped in a town for a day to work in that town and paint portraits of whatever clients they could get. So maybe they brought prefab, partly painted paintings, but that wasn't always the case. Sometimes they did the whole thing. And that was also only itinerant, people that weren't actually located someplace. Without knowing who the artist is here, I cannot really speak to that, whether this painter, this to me looks like something that was done in a studio that he spent quite a bit of time on. And I say he because most of the paintings that we have from that time are male artists. So no one's an art dummy, Melanie. Melanie asks, dolls being a potential object for holding. Are there other objects with that intentionality that would have typically been held that they elected not to have her hold? That's kind of well, the objects that I've always seen, fruit, definitely. I mean, even Jesus was pictured with like the orb and a dove, think about that. Now those are in early, very early Gothic and Renaissance paintings. And it's not Melanie, it's Melanie's boyfriend, okay. So he's claiming not to know the answer to this question. But that is a good question. I don't really know what did they never picture. I can tell you that they did often use those things that we've already seen on screen: books, flowers, things that if you think about what that would convey, the attributes that made you look like you're a child. You're not meant to be seen as an adult. So as a child, you'd be seen as delicate, maybe that's why the book is you'd be seen as educated, and maybe that's a rare thing. If you're wealthy, you're educated, and so that's that sign of being educated. Fruit is just, I think, a common element. I don't know that it symbolizes too much about personality. So I don't know if that helps, but things that if you want to throw something out there, what are they not pictured with?
Well, one thing as you mentioned in one of the earlier ones, but definitely the holding of animals and dolls. And I'm sure we could all think of like, well, what does that signal to you when you see a small girl holding very delicately a doll or a small animal, right? It's the caretaker, the nurturing. Like there are such, I think, of very gendered associations with that also align with the gender construct of the feminine and the caretaker, the nurturer. So to me, I mean, she's still obviously like caring for the book, which I don't want to dismiss that, but like that to me is such like a gender neutral piece, but one that is like showing signifying their commitment to female, a woman's education and reading. But I would say like something I couldn't imagine them holding. I mean, like I couldn't imagine her holding a rifle like that, something like that might have been more like typically associated. I don't even know though. I mean, in terms of that class stature, would they even have had, I don't
or
know.
like, even though I will say this, even though at this era, it wasn't reserved to the domestic help to do the domestic help. So in smaller households like the one at the Roach and Jones Duff House, there were the younger females in the family actually did do the laundry. They might have done some basic household chores. On the other hand, I think that would be something you would not see in a formal portrait. You would not see the little girl holding a broom or holding the iron, because that was considered common. That's then we get into genre painting and that was a whole movement in American painting and European painting too, where somebody was just pictured in an average daily activity and also wasn't necessarily a wealthy person. So I hope that helps. Yeah, no rifles, no brooms, nothing too banal. It was what young girls would have been doing for activities at that time, or something just completely benign like a piece of fruit. So young girls would have been learning needlepoint, they would have been learning household chores. They would have learned how to iron and do laundry. And so it's just, but that kind of thing was not pictured. So I hope that helps. Melanie, not Melanie. There's Melanie. That really is Melanie.
Yes. I thought it was really interesting about the book too, since Josh brought it up, that from studying like early women's history in the early 19th century, that it's also very, like it was important. And I think especially of like women of a particular class, that they were being educated. So I think there's like this misconception that girls weren't educated, but it was sort of like a big thing in wealthy, like upper class white women to be young girls to be educated because they were raising the future leaders. Like they needed to be educated to teach the rest, to teach their sons, basically.
Republican motherhood.
I think that's, you know, it might be a good signifier of like what they're also like saying in the early, you know, sort of decades of the nation.
I love this. Yes, I could not agree more, right? Like it's, so then, right, I mean, it's the notion, right, of Republican motherhood, how we're kind of, especially around the 1830s, where it was about raising the next generation of Republicans, but with small r there, right, to preserve and protect the Republic. Oh my gosh, what a really good point. I hadn't even thought of that, but that totally aligns with like not putting on here like a proto-feminist reading, like, oh, it's all about women's education. Like it was to preserve the Republic and to raise like children that would also be committed to that. Yeah, such a good point. I was thinking too, Mel, as someone who just was rewatching Pride and Prejudice the other day and talking about an accomplished woman, and like in this, also in this time period, would have considered reading like everything we're talking about, like needlepoint, a command of the languages, pianoforte, and like high levels of literacy were a part of that as well. But yeah, maybe not in the proto-feminist way that we like to imagine.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Great. Do you want to say where you're from, Melanie? Because you're a ringer too. Melanie's another ringer in this audience. She's a history person as well.
Yeah, so I work at the Duxbury Historical Society and in Duxbury, which is up near Plymouth. So we recently did a whole project about women's history. So this is particularly in the early 19th century. So this was very like on point to that.
Oh, that's awesome.
So chime in anytime if you have something to add. This is a good group. I didn't see any other questions, but I'll welcome one more time. You know, anyone want to unmute and ask a question of Jordan or myself, or now Melanie's got a. That was a great comment, Melanie.
Hey Don, I see one in the chat from Francis Gray who asked, "I'm curious as to how the artist captures such a calm expression." I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
I guess I would say it was, you know, you don't see portraits of this time with people smiling where they're baring teeth, right? That's just not done. So there's that, the calm expression. And then, so I you know, these were the desirable expressions. You know, it's not like today where everyone says smile before the camera.
Well, that's just it, Dawn. It's Stu. Sam Gray is a photographer, so you got to take that into context when he asks.
Right.
You know, so this child could have been crying, but the painter was able to capture.
It looked like the painter. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Oh, I like that they let her smile. You see so many portraitures of no smile. They almost look so miserable, and that made sense for a lot of things, that it wasn't meant to. I'm sure we've all seen those historical family portraits of just everybody looks miserable, and they're like, that was the best day of our life. Like, what? But I think we see that here, and that I'm glad they let her smile. And that's how the artist kind of imagined her. I think it gives it such a playful childish quality.
It's not even, it's such a mature facial expression. I mean, you know, I don't know how, I've missed a little bit on how old she is in this portrait. But she's probably only about 5. I mean, that's a pretty amazing facial expression for a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah, really.
I mean, it's lovely.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, I would call this a smile, Sam. She's got a slight upturned. Yeah. It's not like a big toothy smile, but it is a smile, and you know, rosy cheeks and very brightly open eyes.
Yes, almost searching.
It makes you wonder when this shift then came to have more of the toothy smiles, and what, I know we'd moved from portraits to photography, but thinking of the wide toothy grins we get now, like what prompted the shift?
Well, when I photograph portraits, I would try and not have them smile that broadly, but to get to that right spot, you know, I had to do a few tricks here and there, and to get it quiet, I used to ask them if they could smile with their face as opposed with their mouth, because that helped the eyes. But it's such a demure, calm, lovely expression.
That reminds me of all the ways we are now kind of encouraged how to smile with a mask on.
Exactly.
Because you need to smile with your whole face,
eyes.
which is like, what? But you only see that much.
It takes practice.
Yeah, that's a great, Sam, that was a great comment, and especially with your artistic background too.
Can I interrupt? When I was young, we never smiled with an open mouth at the camera. We didn't open our mouths when a picture was taken of us, or for a school portrait or anything. You smiled, but you never opened your mouth. And I would think that the artist here had met the little girl and, you know, had looked at her, and so would create that face, not with her standing in front of him. You know, he'd make a quick sketch and then he'd add to it, and he'd, you know, it might be half an hour or 15 minutes. She'd go away and play, and she might come back. And so I'm not surprised that she hasn't got an open mouth, but she is a very sweet little girl. No question about that.
Well, I can say that 8 times out of 10, when I had them smile for me, they never picked the smile.
So in other words, if there were choices in the contact sheet, they wanted the more serious expression or the gentler. Yeah, that's interesting.
And we always tried to find something in between. I did a lot of business portraits, and I went to a lot of corporations to do this stuff. And it was difficult with some people to get them to smile and relaxed without teeth. So anyhow, my 2 cents.
Yeah, that was a great point, just about the smile. Mm-hmm. I can share, since it's come up already, as far as her posing. You know, because there wasn't really, photography wasn't used at the time to the way it might be used now. If you wanted to make a painting of somebody, you could paint from a photograph. Although I will tell you, some painters would never do that. If they're a certain type of painter, they will only paint from life. And that's a more classical approach to painting, is that you only paint from life. You would never, because the photograph flattens things to begin with and the colors are not accurate. But at the time, there wasn't really that choice. So portrait painters only had the choice of painting from life or from another painter's rendering of that subject. So something like this, let's see if I can get to the Joanna Roach as an adult, and this is a small, a miniature, as you can see. It says it's on porcelain. These types of, they were small enough where, you know, somebody could have done this sketch based on somebody else's sketch, or it could serve as a jumping off point, a point of reference for something larger. I'm not saying this one was, but that was one method of, if you didn't have the subject live in front of you, that you could still copy. So you know as much about Joanna Roach as I know at this point, and about that painting. Any last, we have another, let me just see what's in the chat. We have one more question. Yes, a nice calm look. And I'd be curious to know when, I'm sure it's just a cultural norm, when toothy smiles came into fashion, because I suspect that it was considered, you know, almost rude or you know, vulgar or something, you know, before, to show your teeth. And in certain cultures, you either do or don't show your teeth, even today, I think, right? In a picture, so.
I know, a part of me is thinking maybe like post World War II, but then even, I don't know. I think you're right. It'd be just a fascinating look into the history, not only of childhood, but of portraiture and the construction of public presentation. I don't know. So interesting though, because I agree with you. I like, when did that shift? Where I have very toothy portraits of my children. All teeth.
Great. Back then, teeth weren't all that pleasant to look at, somebody adds. There's that as well. Yeah, that's very true. And that could have been the reason for hiding them, being concealed. So everyone can go look that little historical fact up about, and I should know that because from all my art background, but I suspect that's partly why it just wasn't in fashion. It could have been to hide their less attractive features. Some things were choices of the painter too, like hands. The painter might not have been great with hands, so they tucked them inside you know, the old Napoleon hand inside coat could just be that the painter was hiding fingers because they're very hard to paint. So, I think the questions are slowing down, and we've been on the call on the program now for about an hour. We've heard about a whiskey sour and a Joanna Roach. So with that, I do want to thank both of our presenters volunteered their time to be here with you tonight. And I do want to thank them both, and I hope you check out everything that's going on at the YWCA. They've got they do a lot of great work in the community, and we benefit very much from them. And you saw Jonathan's work, and he does that kind of work in all sorts of venues. He'll come to you via the screen or in person. So please check them both out. And thanks everyone for coming. And we hope to see you again in a future program.